Thank you for joining us for Sermons on Demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. We provide these videos as a way to share the pulpit messages and teachings offered at Friendship Grace Brethren Church. If you find these videos a helpful resource, please drop us a note at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com. Now open your Bibles and get ready to dig into the Word of God.
Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for all that you do for us and for loving us. Thank you for men like J. Warner Wallace and his investigations and his ability to put it into ways that make sense to us, and for the work that he does for the kingdom. This morning, as we continue in his presentation of how he can establish the reality of you, thank you for that. Thank you for the folks that are here, for the folks that are online watching and listening. We just pray that you would be honored and glorified as we begin this new year. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, this is the second half of J. Warner Wallace's presentation to Credo House Ministries in Oklahoma.
Back to this. Same question we're asking. Can we stay inside the room to get an answer, or do we have to go outside the room to get an answer? Well, I know one thing. If we're going to stay inside the room, we've got to explain all this, which points to a designer. Is there a designer in the room? That's the problem. What's the designer in the room? And that's why I think, by the way, some people will debate about, give it to them. If you don't need to, take it. You make the case with less. I don't think you can take out enough on this case to destroy the case for design. Okay, so we did this game. Inside, outside. Here's the thing we're looking at. Now, if you want in the Q&A, we can talk about some of the ways they try to explain how this could occur by staying inside the room. Typically, they're going to tell you, well, isn't it possible that this evolved from something that's similar but has less pieces, but serves some other function in the cell? And they usually talk about this type 3 secretion unit. We can talk about that if you want. Or they'll say, well, wait a minute. It can't be as somebody outside the room, because it's outside the room. There's too many design imperfections in biology to account for them by using an outside designer. If there's an all-powerful, all-perfect outside designer, there wouldn't be design imperfections. I don't think that flies either. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. I want to kind of get this down short for you. So the other problem I have, though, is that all these other things that we talked about, which are best explained by an intelligent designer outside the room, exist in the bacterial flagellum. And that's why I think in the end that the outside explanation is the better explanation. Now, let's start here one more time. When we did this, we said, okay, if we can stay inside the room, naturalism explains it, suicide, we'll explain it. If we have to go outside the room, now we've got an intruder. That's the whole premise of how we turn out. And we said what? That intruders really change things. They turn a sense of curiosity into a sense of urgency. That was our whole premise to begin with, right? Okay, so now let's take a look at the universe, and I've only showed you one piece of evidence tonight to ask about this question, inside or outside. I actually think there are a lot more we could say. All of these pieces all have to be explained, and these are even harder to explain by staying inside the room. This alone, I think, is sufficient for us to conclude an outside source is enough, but if you didn't think it was enough, there are the other 7 pieces that we add to the case. That's why I think the case is very strong for an outside source. So in the end, I do think outside is a better explanation, especially when you bring back all the other pieces. This only can be explained by going outside the room. Now, here's the kind of cool thing about it. Each one of these pieces of evidence gives you some attribute of the person who left. Every time you get to a crime scene, I get a piece of evidence in the crime scene. It tells me something about the person who left it. That garrote told us something about the person who built it. Who would take the time to build a garrote to kill somebody? That's somebody who's really committed to killing her. That's probably not a stranger to her. That's somebody who wants her dead. He's actually enjoying the process of creating the weapon he's going to use to kill her. That eliminates a lot of potential suspects, right? I kind of know who we're looking for, or at least the category of guy we're looking for, before I even start, just based on the one piece of evidence. Well, the same kind of thing happens here. Each piece of evidence will tell you something about your suspect. So if I look at the character of these pieces of evidence, I get a suspect profile from the evidence. Who could it be? It's probably not Mick Jagger, okay? Because the reason why it's not Mick is because each piece tells me something about the suspect. If I've got to account for the beginning of all space, time, and matter, whatever starts that cannot itself be spatial, temporal, or material. So I know I'm looking for something that's non-spatial, non-temporal, not material, uncaused. Every piece tells me something that's creative and resourceful. All these things tell me something about who I'm looking for. And it turns out poor Mick does not fit the description. That's why I think the best description to fit the evidence and what the evidence tells us about a suspect is God. Because what could that thing be that could account for not only the beginning of all space, time, and matter and all the fine-tuning we see in the universe, but also could account for the fact that you are more than just a brain. You are a mind that has the ability to make free choices and to reason rationally, and we have a sense of moral truth and obligation, which is always between persons. These are the things that can be explained best if the suspect outside the room is in fact the God that we know of from Scripture. And that's why I've entitled this, kind of taking this approach, and why I've called this God's crime scene. Now when I call it God's crime scene, I don't mean to say he's done a crime. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, when we call God an intruder, is that really a fair way to describe God at all? Can you even call God an intruder in the universe? We're kind of looking for an intruder in the room, right? I don't think we really can. We've had cases, I remember we had a case one time where a neighbor saw across her back fence, she saw a man come to her neighbor's house, go through the side yard gate, go around to the back door, and kick the door in. She's watching it from her backyard across the wall that separates the 2 yards. So she called the police. Someone's breaking into my neighbor's house. He just kicked the door in. Who does that? So we dispatched a bunch of units, right? Surround the house. Nobody will answer the phone. The neighbor says, yeah, I still see movement in there. He's still in there. We're ready to do an entry. When finally, who do you think comes to the front door? Yeah, the owner of the house who had locked himself out. Now, this neighbor had never met that guy because she's behind the wall. She knew her next door neighbor. She didn't know her neighbor behind her. So we get there thinking we have an intruder or a burglar. But we don't have an intruder or a burglar. We have the inhabitant who owns the place, okay? An inhabitant and an owner are not going to go to jail for anything. And I think what we really have here is the same thing. I'm using the word intruder, but really, if this is God's universe, we're really kind of more in an intruder position than he is. Because he's the inhabitant and owner. But actually, he's designed this all for us to begin with. So when I use that word intruder, just make sure you understand I'm not really calling it God's real crime scene. Now, we looked at one piece of a larger case, right, of 8 pieces of evidence that I think if you look at this and you try to explain which of these 2 possible explanations could explain these things that are in the room, I don't think that first one gets it done. And I've only given you one piece of this larger case, okay? But remember, I said that when you have a crime scene, that sense of curiosity you have has to turn to a sense of urgency. And sometimes in juries, when you present a case, people will say something like, well, what if someday we find out that you're wrong about this and there's this piece is slightly different? That's called speculating in jury trials. You're not even allowed to ask the question, what if, in your deliberations. It's an instruction. You only are allowed to deliberate on the evidence you have in front of you right now. So what I want us to do is to say, look, we got to convince ourselves and our friends that you may discover something in science tomorrow. Great. I know it's not going to change anything. Every time I have a case and someone says, well, look, you think this guy's guilty, we could discover something tomorrow. Sure we could. It's possible, not reasonable. Possible. Of course, the next day when he confesses at the sentencing hearing, everyone's going to stop saying that, right? But for now, they all think something can happen tomorrow. I'm sure he's the guy. He'll confess tomorrow. But this is the kind of thing we do all the time in trials. I want us to have a sense of urgency and help our friends to see that, hey, now is the time for decision. It is right now. And if you think, well, I could wait, maybe the science will change. Great, wait yourself to death. The decision has to happen right now for us because this death scenes, they change when they become crime scenes. You should have not a sense of curiosity, you should have a sense of urgency. Make the decision now, based on what you have today. That's what we ask every jury to do. That's all we're asking our friends to do too. Does that make sense? All right, now before I leave you guys, I'll point you to a resource. I didn't bring books. You know what kills me? As I had them sent, but I had them sent to the church. I'm going to tomorrow night. So I don't have any for tonight. But I didn't come to sell you books. I was telling Michael, I retired with a pension so I could do this stuff for free. Because it changes the way you do ministry if you don't need to get to, if you can afford to do it. So what I came to do is to provide you with resources. So I'm going to send to you the resources that kind of support this talk. And it'll be in a folder. You'll be able to open the folder and download all the resources, videos, MP3s, and PDF files. So you can actually go deeper if you want to. They're on a hidden page right now on my website at coldcasechristianity.com/resources. You can't put this in Google. You have to put this in your browser, like Internet Explorer. If you put that in your browser, you'll see, it'll give you a button, looks like this button. When you touch it, it'll say Oklahoma Event Free Follow-Up Materials. Just put your name in there, and I'll send the email on Wednesday before the next event. I'll change it all on Wednesday. That's where you got to go. Okay? And you're only going to get one email from me because they're so expensive to send them. I only send them for these limited purposes. Okay? But I want to have all of, but you'll also be getting all the materials from tomorrow night's talk at the other church, Saturday's talk. I'm also doing an event on Sunday. So you're going to get all that stuff. You can just throw it all away or just do nothing with it. It's your choice. All right, now that we've covered basically part of what I would cover ordinarily. I did not cover any of the alternatives, how we want to explain this naturally. But I can do that with you if you want. But I wanted to leave this time. I'm probably getting late already, so you can ask questions. So now is the time. Go. So the question has to become then, so here's the question. Can we get there through a blind process? What he's basically saying is that time and the natural laws of physics could account for all of this. Those are the only, in a material universe where all you have is stuff, nothing immaterial, right? Because this is what Dawkins believes in, a material universe. That means all you have is space, time, matter, and the laws that govern such things. Which would be what? Laws of physics and chemistry. Okay. Can that explain all of it? Can that explain all the attributes of design? Could those things even explain information alone? That's the problem we're going to have with that. I'm still waiting to see what the explanation is going to be for information. We used to think physics is at the foundation of everything in science. It's at the foundation of everything in the universe. Turns out, maybe not. Looks like information is at the basis of everything. Information is the driving foundation that drives everything. Well, it's, you can just say, well, laws of physics are just what they are because that's just what they are. We don't invent them. We just discover them. Well, how do we explain information? Can physics and chemistry get us information? That's really tough. Did entire chapters on origin of life, which just talks about this issue of information and the different levels. There's like 6 levels of information. DNA is the highest level of information. It's not just information that contains language. It's language which is given with the intent that it'll be understood by the receiver. Not only that, but then the receiver will react in the way I intended. That's the highest level of information you can get. And when we get to that point, it's really hard to explain DNA that any other way. There's things called, some statistical information, like, you've probably heard it said that if I was to spell out with Scrabble cubes on the floor, to be or not to be, that is the question, right? It's almost, how would you ever how many times do you have to throw the Scrabble pieces on the floor until it comes and creates that sentence with all the spaces where they're supposed to be? Okay, but you know what? Be honest. I could throw the Scrabble pieces on the floor, it could have some crazy sequence. I could never repeat that crazy sequence either. So is that information? Well, in some sense, that Scrabble bunch of nonsense is information, but it's the lowest level of information. So it turns out there are levels of information, and DNA resides at the highest level. It's going to be hard to explain DNA with just laws of physics. I just think it is. Go.
Well, Behe came out with the irreducible complexity. There was a lot of don't believe in God, or what's your take on it?
This question is about Behe's book and how when he first wrote it, it was I don't think it was ever all that well received by naturalists. It sure created a hoopla, but right away it started a storm of opposition, alternative explanations. For example, the explanation that we can get to that type 3 secretion system and get to the bacterial flagellum, right? Some alternative explanations. Well, Behe's latest edition of that book, he's answered all of those. Actually, the issue with the irreducible complexity in the bacterial flagellum has stood up very, very well over time. Now, there's an alternative they offer to this other machine that exists also in certain organisms. And if we want to go into that later, if some of you want to stay late, we can go through that. But I just don't see it as the problem. Well, I'll go through that with you later if you want to go through it. But the alternate explanations that are offered, really he's addressed all of those in the latest edition of that book. I think it has 15th year reprint or something recently. And he also, I asked him, I sent the book to him. I said, would you just vet this chapter for me and make sure I'm not writing any checks I can't cash? And he said, yes, I'll do that. And so he's been very helpful to me personally. Really good guy. Go.
So you alluded to this earlier.
Okay, you know what? Should we just go through that? Should we just go through it? Do you want us to go through? I only have 2 alternate explanations. Now you kind of asked for both of them. So let's just go through it real quickly. Okay, every time you go into a court case, I don't care who it is, we spend 8 weeks in front of a jury presenting our side of it. Do you think at the end of that case I just showed you, that was Robert Shapiro in that case, okay? He was the guy on the defense side. We did it in the same courtroom as OJ, okay, this last year. Do you think at the end of our 8-week presentation, Robert stood up and says, wow, that was really good. You know what? I can't really say anything about that. We're done. We rest. No. He's now going to spend 8 weeks with all kinds of expert eyewitnesses that he's going to call with an alternative theory, which is going to look just hopefully as reasonable as ours does to that jury. It doesn't mean he has the truth. Every defense attorney is going to present a case. I've had attorneys present the case just to have their client confess at sentencing. It shocked their attorneys also. So I guess that 8-week thing we just went through was all or nothing, wasn't it? Yes, it was all or nothing. Now he's confessing. So I want you to know that because somebody can offer an alternative explanation does not mean it's true. So that's the first thing, okay? But I see objections in typically a few categories. I've written about them in the book. I'll just cover the first one here. Sometimes they'll say, I've got a better explanation. The defense will say, I've got an alternative explanation that's better than what you think my client did. So let's talk about what it is in this one. Remember that here, the nature of evolution, as Darwin first wrote about it, is additive. It's incremental change over time. It's incremental change over, you start with one thing. If the organism survives better with that one thing, that one mutation from the DNA replication, then guess what? It's more likely to survive and retain that one thing, and its offspring will retain that one thing. If there's another mutation that happens to benefit and even add to that one thing, so now you have 2 things connected that help that thing survive, then it's going to be more likely to pass it on to its offspring. And this is why we have additive change over time in organisms that eventually could account for maybe the building blocks to that bacterial flagellum. It starts off as one protein that seemed to benefit the bacteria, and then that has survived better, and it was advanced. The second thing came along. That happened 40 times until finally we have a bacterial flagellum. That's really the only explanation we can look at here. So remember the additive nature of evolution. Basically, it's rejecting the stuff that's bad and preserving and adding up all that is good. This is what he said, Darwin says, drives the evolutionary process, right? Okay, great. Let's say I start off with this. How many of you guys, Legos are like, my wife's German, and we have more Legos at our house when my kids were growing up. So we saved them all, because now we're getting ready to build one room for my grandkids, which aren't even close to being here yet, okay? We're probably 6 years away from grandkids, but I've got plans for a Lego room, okay? And when I was going to have tables and like shelves, Legos all over them, it's going to be awesome. My kids are going to want to come to my house all the time. So what if my son asked me, hey, can you build me a police helicopter? I could probably do that. I could start building it piece by piece, and I get to a certain point. But if I stop right there, he's not going to be satisfied with that. That's not a helicopter. It might be on the way to a helicopter, but that's not what he's looking for. He wants me to go the whole way, right? He wants me to finish this thing so that it actually is what he's looking for. And you can see that over a period of time, I could probably do it. Now, if I stopped right here and tried to convince him that this is something worth doing, where's that going to end up? He's not going to play with that. This is the problem with evolutionary processes. Something like this, halfway to the goal that is needed. The goal here is a helicopter. He needs to play with the helicopter. Halfway to the goal, that's not going to get it done. That's going to probably end up in the trash or on the ground, broken, whatever. It turns out in order to get what we want, we start with one piece, like evolution, and it adds over time. But how we do it is we open up a manual that tells us how to build it. I don't build those things from scratch, do you? I kept every manual for every set of Legos my kids ever had. Why? Because I might want to build those things again, and I don't want to spend hours doing it, right? It's hard enough to find the stupid pieces. But in the end, the goal here is to get to this. But what if I lost the manual and I'm trying to get to this? Wouldn't it be helpful to have something that's halfway there? This is the explanation that naturalists try to give with the bacterial flagellum. Yeah, it's hard to explain how a flagellum could come together like that, but guess what? If it could start with something simpler, that's halfway there, then it's not so hard to get to 40 pieces. If I'm starting with 20. Turns out they've identified something, because it's a lot easier to get from here to the helicopter than it is to get from 0 to the helicopter. Would you agree? Okay, well, it turns out they've found something called a type 3 secretion system that is very similar. You can see how similar it is to the bacterial flagellum. So the argument here is, well, how do we know that now I've found an evolutionary precursor? I found the thing that it evolved from to get to this. Mind you, this does something that's incredibly different than this does. But the argument is, now I can explain how it happened. It got from here to there. Done. Same as it got from here to here. Done. Got it? But I think you recognize something right away, don't you? If you were to look in that Lego box and you saw all the loose pieces, but you also found this, would you think to yourself, wow, that came together pretty amazingly? No, you'd know that's a piece of something that was designed. The problem with this thing is also irreducibly complex. It has all the attributes of irreducible complexity itself. If you're going to say this thing, you're going to have to explain how we got to this thing. That's the problem with everything they've offered. In law enforcement, you have to take a test. One of the simplest written tests you take in law enforcement is this one. They'll give you a map, and they'll say, okay, dude, your car is here. Bank robbery's over here. How do you get from here to there? Figure it out. It's going to be a real job for a cop one day. You got to figure out how to get there. Well, that seems easy. I can see a path right now. Oh, no, it's not that easy. Some of these roads are a little more difficult than others. Some of these roads, as a matter of fact, have certain restrictions. They're one-way streets. Oh, it's a little harder to get there now, isn't it? Oh, and some of these roads, you can't even drive on at all. Oh, yeah, and some of these roads have some construction, so if you go that way, it's going to be a lot slower. You want to get there fast. Oh, yeah, and some of these roads have got these other problems. Oh, my gosh, really? This is getting to be ridiculous. I mean, the more you add to this, the more difficult it becomes, right? All these little problems. How do I get from here to here? Well, I want you to think of it the same way as this process of evolution we've been talking about, okay? The goal is to get from something simple to something complex. And these are all the minefields we have to go through to get there. So if we were to say, okay, let's just replace the objects here and see what we get. Wouldn't it be great to have it at GPS? If you had a GPS, that'd be easy, right? Ooh, think about that for a second. Okay, let's come back to this. So here's our destiny, and let's just change these out a little bit. Here's a single protein. If this benefits the organism, it'll be retained by the organism, and another mutation may occur that could give you 2 proteins assembled. Eventually, you're trying to get to a 40-plus protein flagellum. Got it? We got to get from here to here. How do I explain this? How do I get here? Well, of course, it'd be great if I had that GPS, right? Something that would actually help me get there. Now, how it's been explained, of course, we do have a GPS, right? What's it called? It's called DNA. That's the GPS that's helping this thing happen. But the alternative explanation offered by naturalists is something kind of different. They say, I know how to get from here to here. That. Wait, that doesn't help me. That's not a map. That's a location. It'd be like saying, how do you get from Hawaii to New York? Los Angeles. Well, how do I get to Los Angeles? You got to get me to Los Angeles first before you can get me. I need more than just a spot. I need you to tell me how I get to here. And then, how do I get to there? In other words, I need you to show me what the 2 protein thing did that was so valuable. And then get me from there just one step, a single brick, right? Go into your 40-piece helicopter. I need you to show me, how did I get to this? And then this chassis, how did I get to the first piece that was helpful? By the way, this has to be retained by the organism. The 2 protein thing has to, what is that thing doing for the organism? Well, I don't know. What could the 2 protein, I don't know. Do you have any example of a 2 protein thing still in the organism? No, I don't know. And by the way, if you had an example of what that was doing, once it becomes a 3-protein thing, you've got to explain how that function that used to be being done by the 2-protein thing is still getting done. Right? In other words, you need a step-by-step roadmap that gets you from 1 protein all the way to 40. And you've got to show me how each one of these is worth keeping. Because guess what? In this path I'm giving you, none of these are really worth keeping and playing with. My kid can't play with any of those. He's getting a little bit easier, but really it's not a functional helicopter until the very end. So if you're going to explain naturally how this occurs, you can't give me this thing, because that thing needs to be explained, number one. And you got to show me how each piece along the way was useful. That's the problem with the explanation. Got it? So in the end, even most naturalists now are starting to doubt this idea, that somehow we can get in this direction. They can't figure out how to get from here. They can't find anything in between these two things that makes any sense. What was the 22-piece thing doing? What's the 24-piece thing that's so valuable that it gets retained? What's the 25-piece thing do? I need to know step by step why it's being retained by the system. So instead they've said, you know what? I can't even get to here before I can get to here. Maybe I've got the thing backwards. And a lot of actual evolutionary biologists now believe that the type 3 secretion system is a de-evolution from this machine. Because that's much easier to explain. Right? It's much easier to explain how this got to this than it is to how this got to this. Got me? So that's why the explanation is now going in the opposite direction. Does that make sense? If this is an irreducibly complex, it's obviously designed. If that is irreducibly complex, it's obviously designed also. Now we're going to take one more step with you, because this answered one of the questions. By the way, remember, this is the nature of the additive nature of evolution. Darwin said, if there's irreducible complexity, my theory's got a problem. He even said it this way. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So because we can't explain these, by the way, that's only one of several irreducibly complex systems that Behe writes about in Darwin's Black. And now you've got people writing about all kinds of new ones. Blood clotting, all kinds of other organisms, just the way the heart and metabolism function. I mean, you can go on and on. These are all irreducibly complex. Let me go just to the last objection, then we'll be done with these objections. I think this is the one you were talking about. Another objection can simply be this. Your explanation about that bad guy has a flaw. Well, that's kind of what they're doing here. If there's an all-powerful designer who's responsible for the design we see in biology, can you explain to me how you get crazy things like this? The panda that's got this ridiculous paw that's about useless. I mean, it seems to be a very poor design. If there's an all-powerful designer, shouldn't he have been able to do a better job on some of these things? We see some, for example, the idea of the eye has often been used because there's a blind spot in the eye, in the back of the eye, the optical inversion, all that stuff. So the argument is, wouldn't a designer have done it differently, done it better? This looks more like kind of random chance by evolutionary processes than something that a designer focused in on. Well, I want to remind you of something as Christians. We all believe in change over time. We all believe in some form of evolution. Not this kind of evolution. But we do believe that all of us in this room came from one pair of humans, right? Adam and Eve. And we look very different in this room. We're different races in this room, ethnicities in this room. How can that be? How can all this diversity come from the first pair? Because things change over time. We've been designed in such a way that we can adapt for survival. Our skin will change color, our height will change, just enough. We'll always be humans, but we'll change in our variations in our humanity to survive in our environment, right? Well, one thing you could never do is take a look at the first. You can't look at this pair and really tell me for sure what this pair looked like, right? Because this pair has now changed over time based on its environment. So you wouldn't look at this and go, what a crummy design, because you don't know how close this is to the original anymore. Things change over time given in their environment. You wouldn't say, what a crummy, why would God make such a crummy thing? This looks dead. Well, no, of course, you wouldn't judge. Things change over time. You wouldn't look at this design and say to yourself, okay, I can see a designer there, but I can't see a design. Who would design a birdhouse like that? Think about it. It's got a big crack down the middle. It won't even keep the water out. It's ridiculous. Well, of course, this is not the design. This is the design. This is what the design looks like over time. Got it? So anytime we're going to look at anything today, it'd be foolish for us to think it necessarily represents the original design. We don't know what the original design was. We just know what the adaptation is over time. So take a picture of this now and think, well, what a crummy design. If God designed this panda, he did it pretty bad. Well, how do you know what that first design was? You have no idea. Things change over time. That's the first point. The second point is the best person to tell you what the design is always the designer. Do you guys know what this is? Do you know what that is? Cheese grater. No, it's not a cheese grater. Although you could use it as a cheese grater, but it doesn't have the raised edges you would need to catch the cheese. But if you push really hard, you could probably get cheese to go through that. Some people will say they think it's a strainer. And you could kind of use it as a strainer if you wanted to, but it wouldn't be a really effective strainer. If you wanted to know what this really is, there's actually a manufacturer's name on this. You could find out. I know what it is because my wife is German. This is a spatula maker. This makes German noodles. You pour the batter over boiling water. It drops through the grate. You slide it back and forth. It makes noodles about that long. Got it? But the best way to discover, is that a good design or not? Because if you went back to this and you said, that's a really crummy design. That makes, what a mess it makes of cheese. That's the worst cheese grater I've ever seen. When you use it as a strainer, the water goes everywhere. It's a terrible strainer. If someone's going to design that, they did a really crummy job. Well, maybe you don't know what they designed it for. And if you knew what they designed it for, you know that's a perfect design. Well, let's take a look at his hand. Panda's thumb. What a crummy design. I mean, come on. How in the world could you ever open a Coke with that hand? You could never do it. Could you? No. But if what you're trying to do is strip bamboo, because that's your chief source of food, that's an excellent design. So again, a lot of this comes down to understanding what is the design for to begin with, right? Let me give you one last piece. Here's my master's thesis. It is a police and fire facility in Santa Barbara, California. Everything in Santa Barbara is Spanish mission style, so it's always kind of looks like this. So I'm trying to design them in the context. I remember when I first drew this up, I wanted certain things to line up in a certain way. So for example, in the top elevation, I really wanted that tower to be right behind this tower. Because I thought from the street elevation, it would look better. But the problem was on the back side, if I did that in the floor plan of the building, it messed up my floor plan. And on the back side, it created a problem. I liked the way that was lined up. I lost that, so I just made a compromise to get the best design that accomplished my total objective, even though if you looked at one aspect of it, you might say, well, that could be better over there. Yeah, you're probably right, but then it would have messed up the other thing. This is what designers do all the time. We're constantly making design choices based on compromise. The best designs, in fact, are always based on intelligent compromises considering the end goal. As a matter of fact, here's a guy who's an engineer who says it better than me. When a new design removes one of these annoyances, it's more likely than not fails to address some others or adds a new annoyance of its own. This is what makes engineering and inventing so challenging. All design involves conflicting objectives and hence compromise. And the best designs will always be those that come up with the best compromise. Got it? So I think when you look at this objection that, hey, this can't be from an outside designer because I see something that I would have done differently. Really? Well, first of all, you're looking at what you see today. That's not the original design. Number two, you don't necessarily know what the designer had in mind. And all design, the best design, is a product of compromise. Always. It's like you can't have a square circle. You want good design, you have to compromise. These things are not, they're mutually exclusive, right? You can't have one without the other. Go.
See, the original then you see as good, perfect, I don't know the right word, and then we're seeing deterioration with time.
Well, whether you want, so it's asking is the original perfect? Well, whether you call the original perfect, I'm not going to say that. I'm saying the original is the intent of the designer. Whatever that intent is. You might say, well, I think that's a bad idea. Well, that's what we think. But the original intent of the designer is present in the original, given the compromises you have to make in any good design. But what we see today is what's changed over time. I try not to give it a word good or bad, because how do I have to know the mind of God. Right, exactly. Yeah, go ahead. Got a question back here. So there's a couple of things you just raised. One is, it's kind of like, but you want to know what my view of the role of science is and why that would differ from an evolutionist. It sounds like you're saying the evolutionists would say, hey, we don't have an answer for this yet, but someday we might. So that's a science of the gaps, right? In other words, if I said to you, hey, I don't know how God managed to do this, but someday I'll know when I ask him. That's the very equivalent of saying, I don't know how naturalism could explain this, but someday we hope science will give us an answer. They would never be patient with us saying, hey, I don't know now, but someday I hope to have an answer. That would not suffice. That's why I said in a courtroom, in a jury, that's like saying, well, what if we get a different answer later? You can't do what ifs. I'm just asking you to move on what we know today. If all we did was move on what we know today, that's all we can do is make decisions on what we know today. And I don't think that the science, see, for me, science is another way to uncover evidence. But evidence tells me nothing. Science tells me nothing. Scientists tell me something. Juries decide what the evidence infers. The evidence doesn't have a voice. You just collect this stuff, you put it in a big pile. The people who have a voice are the people who are evaluating the evidences. So in other words, that means that the scientist gets to evaluate the evidence. If, however, the scientist is absolutely committed, regardless, to a wholly philosophical, naturalistic worldview, and it allows for no other options, then you're only going to get one kind of answer, the philosophically natural answer. Now, I'm not committed to all supernatural answers. Obviously, I work criminal cases. I don't take ghosts to jail. I don't take demons to jail. I take physical people to jail. So I'm open to both kinds of answers. But I am open to both kinds of answers. And one thing for sure, I'm really focused on what's inside and outside the box. How do we explain this given a completely naturalistic explanation? Could anything ever provide us with information, goal direction, all the things I talked about, if all we're using are physics, chemistry, and matter? And maybe we can, but I got to see that answer. What would that answer look like? If the answer is, yeah, you start with this thing that's already that already has irreducible complexity, the 22-piece type 3 secretion system. How do we get that? Well, I don't know. Someday we'll hope to find out through science, but I don't know right now. Do you have any explanation? Do you have any example of anything below that in the line? No. Anything between that in the line? No. So what do you do? And the question is, of course, well, someday we might have that, but that seems to trust something other than the evidence you have. That trusts a philosophical worldview you hold that says, hey, naturalism has to explain it, because that's all there is naturalism. Go.
2 questions.
Yes.
One online here, a little bit of a setup. Goes to the design.
Yes.
If the universe is wonderfully designed,
Mm-hmm.
surely God is even more wonderfully designed. He must therefore have had a designer even more wonderful than he is. If God did not require a designer, then there's no reason why such a relatively less wonderful thing as the universe
Right.
needed one.
Perfect. Great question. You have that. I don't need to repeat it, do I? Thank you. See, there is a God. I just proved it. Don't have to repeat that question. It's a great question. It really comes down to this idea of, well, if there is a God who's either the first creator of the universe or the designer of the fine-tuned universe, either way, why would we believe that that's the beginning point we should start at? Wouldn't that thing itself also have to be explained in some way? It turns out that all of us on both sides of this equation, I think, if it's an Alex Vilenkin at Tufts University, if it's a Paul Davies, if it's a Lawrence Krauss, we're all looking for the same thing. The uncaused first cause of everything we see. And if that uncaused first cause, like they would like it to be an eternal quantum vacuum that's got no cause, that has the creative power to produce such a large number of universes that eventually one looks like ours, well, that's an explanation of an uncaused first cause. And I can easily ask the same question. So all of us are looking for the same thing. We're all trying. I just think that uncaused first cause, when you start to shape out what it looks like in terms of a suspect description, has to not only account for design, but then we need another account for how we get what we all believe we have, which is the ability to reason right now. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, is that true? Well, that means you must have a certain freedom in your mental process in order to decide if that's true. But how could you have that kind of freedom if you're in a material universe in which all you have is matter? If that's the kind of universe we live in, it's a deterministic universe. It's one domino. It's a neuron firing that causes the next neuron to fire. That was caused by a sequence before it. You didn't make that decision. That decision, maybe it's illusory. You might think you made a decision, but in fact, you're just a one sequence of dominoes away from some other prior cause. If that's the kind of universe we live in, if that atheism is true, that really is the kind of materialistic universe we live in, then can you even reason freely to decide if there's a first cause? So we're looking for the thing that not only causes the universe and the fine-tuning of the universe, but has the ability to originate life in this universe and design what it looks like design features in that life that can also produce minds that have the free agency to consider objective, transcendent moral truths and by comparison know that some things are evil. Wow, can the quantum eternal vacuum produce all of that? It seems whatever's producing that is pretty robust, pretty rich in its characteristics. And that's why I think the best explanation for that suspect is at least a being that is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, a source of great creative power, resourceful in that way, the source of all transcendent objective moral truth, who's a free agent, who is a mind and creates in his own image. That's why you have minds and free agency, and the standard by which we judge everything we call evil. That kind of first cause could explain everything we see in the universe. Go.
You described yourself as angry, militant, atheist.
Well, I wasn't like the kind of guy, there was no internet when I was in, this is 80, this is the 70s and 80s, and I guess I was 96 when I got saved. So I guess there was some internet, but not much. So I wasn't out there like trolling on social media to make everyone's day miserable. But the guys I worked with who were Christians knew not to bother me on this issue. And my wife knew, don't bring it up. But I also, my dad was, no Christians in my family, my dad was an atheist, but he would go to church with his wife because he thought that's what you do. You go to church, and then church teaches your kids how to be good people. So he was very much in favor of, if you want to go to church, I'll drop, he would drop me. When I was a little kid, my mom would want me to go to church. She was kind of a cultural Catholic, but had never ever opened a Bible, had no idea what the Bible taught. But she wanted me to go on weekends. I didn't want to go. I was an atheist. I was committed early on this. My dad said, I'll tell you what, I'll drop you. He didn't care if I went in the church or not, just as long as I could say, I dropped him at the Mass. The Mass is 7 o'clock. I dropped him there. So it was just, that's kind of me growing up. But when we had kids, my wife was raised also as a cultural Catholic, also having no idea really what that even meant. But when we had kids, she was really kind of wanted to have our kids raised in the church. So I was willing to go as an atheist, because my dad had been doing that for years. And I was in a new town. I had been in it for about 3 years. We had been living there. And there's a big church. And one Saturday, she said, let's go to church tomorrow. I said, if you want to go to church, I'll go to church with you. I thought there was a Catholic church around the corner. You want to go there? No, your buddy's been talking about this church over here. So we went. And so at 35, I walk in, and this is a very felt needs kind of a church. And the pastor just threw Jesus in a way that I could catch him. This Jesus guy, he's pretty smart. You might want to listen to what he has to say because he's got some pretty good stuff to say about certain issues. That's a very kind of baseline version of Jesus, would you agree? But for a guy like me who is not interested in the supernatural Jesus, I never rejected Jesus' very existence. I would have been happy to read the prophetic words of Buddha or some other person that would not accept as God either. So I bought a Bible to read the words of Jesus just to see what he had to say, if this was true, what this guy was saying. And as I read through the Gospels, I started to recognize those attributes of eyewitness statements that were really compelling for me as an investigator. And that's how I wrote Cold Case, because that was this process that I went through to become a Christian. So when I got to a place where I was like, wow, this is kind of hard to reject as unreliable, what do I do with the resurrection? Well, that's something that's a supernatural event that I would have always rejected. So that's when I went back and did this work. And said, do I have good reason to believe that there is something that could account for a resurrection? And in the end, I think that this case is strong on its own. I could, if you're going to struggle with whether you could be a Christian or not, accept the Gospels as reliable, that's one thing. But I don't know how in the world you could ever go back to being an atheist. You'd have to at least be a deist to account for this stuff. And so I think in the end, that was the process I went through. And it's kind of an unorthodox process, but I was just somebody who had to kind of look at it as an investigator. So cold case Christianity is really taking a look at all the cold case tools we use to deter. Think about my cases. Cases where you have a guy who made a statement in 1980, now that witness is dead. And the officer who wrote the statement from that witness is also dead. So now I've got a supplemental report with a dead reporter and a dead witness. What does that sound like to you? Those are the Gospels. If you're going to evaluate those supplemental reports using a certain skill set, you can apply that to the Gospels. And that's what cold case is about.
I love his stuff. He's no, not to this particular one, but you can go to coldcasechristianity.com, or on your phone there's an app that gives you all that, and he's got podcasts and videos. He's one of my favorite apologists. I have a bunch, but he's one of my favorites because I understand his thought process. Yeah, and I like the way he does it. Lee Strobel from Chicago area, now living in Southern California, approached it from the same vein. He was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune and had an education in the law. He was not an attorney, but he had a kind of an interesting law degree that for reporters for the law. And he did the exact same thing. A Case for Christ is all about his investigation and his determination. Yeah, these facts are true, and that leads me to conclude that something is here that I need to investigate further. And I love those kinds of processes. Right. Right. We did a series here for a while. Dr. Habermas, who is one of the foremost Christian authorities on the resurrection, and the first few videos he outlined. Here are the facts that we're going to use to determine if, or the tools that we're going to use to determine if these facts are true. And he does it very much in the same vein. There's a large body of work out there like that. But if you on your phone just do Cold Case Christianity app, all of that stuff will be right there. Jay Warner's a great guy. I enjoy his stuff. I have not met him. I've met Lee Strobel. I've met almost don't want to say his name anymore, Ravi Zacharias, and guys like that are really good apologists. I've met several of them. I would love to sit down and have dinner with him sometime. Yeah. Okay, let's pray. Thank you, Father, for allowing us to spend some time reviewing what Jay Warner has produced. Thank you for men like him that have written and talked about ways that we can show to our friends and neighbors how they could interpret what we see in the world differently than the way the atheist, the anti-Christian world wants to see it. Thank you for the reality of who you are. Thank you for your sovereignty. Thank you for your creation of the universe. Give us a great time in the service to follow, and we trust that you would be honored and glorified in Jesus' name.
Thank you for watching or listening to this teaching on demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. Please consider sending us an email at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com to let us know how this teaching may have helped you. Please also consider joining us in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church, located at 10251 Metro Parkway, Suite 116, Fort Myers, Florida, just south of the intersection of Metro and Colonial Boulevard. Sunday school begins at 9 and worship service at 10 a.m. We look forward to seeing you in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church.